The ice came first. It formed along the hull in jagged white plates, thick as a man's arm, coating the deck railings and the forward gun mount until the steel disappeared beneath it. Edward Callahan stood on the bridge wing of the SS Thomas Jefferson, a Liberty ship 8 days out of Reykjavik, and watched the Arctic night press down around the convoy like a fist. He was 31 years old, a second mate in the United States Merchant Marine, and he had never been this cold in his life. The wind cut through his wool peacoat and leather gloves as if they were made of paper. Below him, on the main deck, 2 seamen chipped ice from the lifeboats with fire axes, their breath hanging in clouds that froze before dissipating. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. The sea was black and heavy, the swells slow and deliberate, and somewhere beneath that water, invisible and patient, German U-boats prowled the convoy's flanks. It was January 1942. Convoy PQ-13 was bound for Murmansk, carrying 6,000 tons of ammunition, crated fighter planes, medical supplies, and 200 trucks lashed to the deck under canvas tarps. Callahan had been told the cargo was critical. He had been told the Red Army was bleeding out in the snow outside Moscow, that Soviet factories were being dismantled and moved east ahead of the Wehrmacht, that without this shipment and 100 more like it, the Eastern Front might collapse entirely. He did not know if that was true. He knew only that the Thomas Jefferson was slow, unarmed except for a single 3-inch gun on the stern, and that if a torpedo found them, they would have less than 3 minutes to abandon ship before the cold killed them all. The convoy moved in columns, 18 merchant ships flanked by 4 British destroyers and a pair of corvettes. They kept radio silence. At night, the only lights visible were the faint phosphorescence of the wake and, on rare clear evenings, the shimmer of the aurora borealis rippling green and violet across the northern sky. Callahan had seen the aurora twice since leaving Iceland. Both times it had felt like an omen, though he could not say of what. The men did not talk much. They stood their watches, ate their meals, and slept in their clothes with their life vests within arm's reach. The galley served hot coffee around the clock, thick and bitter, and the cook kept a pot of stew simmering on the stove because no one knew when the next hot meal might come. Callahan drank the coffee and did not sleep well. He dreamed of explosions, of water flooding into compartments, of men screaming in the dark. When he woke, the dream stayed with him, a weight in his chest that did not lift. On the 9th day, the convoy's escort commander signaled a course change to the northeast. The weather had worsened. Snow fell in dense curtains, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards, and the wind howled across the deck with a sound like tearing metal. Callahan stood in the wheelhouse, watching the compass and the ship ahead, a Norwegian freighter whose stern light bobbed in and out of the snow like a dying star. The captain, a gray-haired Swede named Lindström, stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. Lindström had made this run before. He had been on a convoy the previous autumn when a U-boat wolf pack had scattered the ships and sunk 4 of them in a single night. He had spent 6 hours in a lifeboat before a destroyer picked him up. He did not talk about it, but Callahan had heard the story from the chief engineer who had sailed with Lindström for years. The captain's silence was not comforting. At 03:40 hours, the alarm sounded. Callahan was asleep in his bunk when the klaxon tore through the ship, a rising wail that sent him scrambling for his boots and coat. He reached the bridge in less than a minute. Lindström was already there, binoculars raised, scanning the darkness to port. The radio operator, a thin kid from Pennsylvania named Morris, was bent over his set, headphones clamped to his ears, listening. "Torpedoes in the water," Morris said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. 2 ships hit, the escorts dropping depth charges. Callahan grabbed his own binoculars and looked out into the night. He saw nothing at first, only the snow and the black water. Then, off the port quarter, a column of fire erupted from the sea. It climbed into the sky, orange and white, and for a moment the entire convoy was lit up like daylight. Callahan saw the burning ship, a British freighter, her bow already submerged, her stern lifting out of the water as men threw themselves over the rails. He saw the other ships scattering, breaking formation, and he saw the destroyers racing past, sleek and fast, their depth charges rolling off the stern in quick succession. The explosions came seconds later, deep concussive thumps that Callahan felt in his bones. Lindstrom ordered hard to starboard. The Thomas Jefferson heeled over, the deck tilting as the helmsman spun the wheel. Callahan braced himself against the chart table and watched the burning freighter slide past their stern, close enough that he could hear the crackle of the flames and the shouts of men in the water. The ship went down in less than 2 minutes. One moment she was there, a gutted wreck spilling fire and smoke, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the sea. The men in the water did not last long. Callahan knew that. In water this cold, hypothermia set in within minutes. The body shut down, the muscles stopped working, and then it was over. The destroyers did not stop to pick up survivors. They could not. The U-boats were still out there, and a stopped ship was a dead ship. Callahan understood the logic. It did not make it easier to watch. The convoy regrouped at dawn. 2 ships had been sunk, a third damaged and limping on one engine. The escorts remained on high alert, sonar pinging, searching for the wolf pack they knew was still shadowing them. Callahan stood on the bridge wing, staring out at the empty sea, and felt the weight of what they were doing settle over him like a shroud. This was not a war of front lines and infantry charges. This was attrition, a slow, grinding calculus of tonnage and lives. Every ship that made it through delivered the means for the Red Army to hold, to counterattack, to push back. Every ship that went down meant guns that would not fire, trucks that would not move, soldiers who would freeze or starve or die for lack of ammunition. Callahan did not know the men who would use the cargo in the Thomas Jefferson's holds. He would never meet them, but he knew, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that their survival depended on his. If this convoy failed, entire Soviet armies would stall in the snow. The convoy pressed on through the storm. The ice thickened on the deck, and the men worked in shifts to clear it, knowing that too much weight topside could capsize the ship in heavy seas. Callahan worked alongside them, swinging a maul, feeling the shock of each blow travel up his arms. The labor kept him warm, but it also kept him from thinking too much about the freighter that had gone down, about the men in the water, about the fact that it could just as easily have been the Thomas Jefferson. The convoy had entered the most dangerous stretch of the route, the narrows between Bear Island and the Norwegian coast, where German aircraft and U-boats operated with near impunity. Intelligence reports, relayed by the escort commander, warned of increased enemy activity. Callahan heard the reports and said nothing. There was nothing to say. On the 11th day, the weather broke. The snow stopped, the wind dropped, and the sky cleared to a pale, washed-out blue. It was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Without the storm for cover, the convoy was exposed, visible for miles. Callahan watched the horizon and waited. The attack came at noon. 3 Junkers Ju-88 bombers, flying low and fast out of the north, their engines a distant drone that grew rapidly into a roar. The escorts opened fire, their anti-aircraft guns hammering, and the merchant ships increased speed, zigzagging, trying to make themselves harder targets. Callahan saw the bombs fall, black shapes tumbling end over end, and he saw the waterspouts they raised, towering columns of white that drenched the ships nearby. The Thomas Jefferson was not hit. A Dutch freighter 2 columns over took a bomb amidships and exploded, her cargo of ammunition going up in a fireball that shook the sea. There was no time to react, no time to grieve. The planes banked and came around for a second pass, and the guns fired again, and Callahan crouched behind the bridge bulkhead and prayed that the next bomb would not have his name on it. The convoy lost 4 ships that day. By the time they reached Murmansk, 13 remained. The Thomas Jefferson was among them. Callahan stood on the deck as the ship eased into the harbor, past the skeletal remains of bombed-out warehouses and the rusting hulks of ships that had not been so lucky. Soviet dock workers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, watched from the pier. They did not cheer. They did not wave. They simply waited, ready to unload the cargo as soon as the ship tied up. Callahan looked at them and thought about the journey, about the men who had died to get this far, and about the men who would die using what the Thomas Jefferson had carried. He thought about the fact that this was only one convoy, that there would be others, that the war had only just begun. He did not feel victorious. He felt tired and cold and old beyond his years. He thought about the lieutenant on the burning freighter, the one he had watched go under. He thought about the fact that no one would remember that man's name or the names of any of the others who had died in these waters. They would be footnotes, statistics, casualties of a war fought in the margins. But the ammunition would reach the front, the trucks would roll, the guns would fire, and somewhere, in a frozen forest or a shattered city, a Soviet soldier would live one more day because Edward Callahan and men like him had refused to turn back. The trucks arrived at the front in March of 1943, nearly 14 months after the Thomas Jefferson unloaded her cargo in Murmansk. They came by rail from the port, packed in boxcars that rattled east across the Urals and into the steppes beyond, and from there they were driven south toward the Kursk salient, where the Red Army was preparing for the German summer offensive everyone knew was coming. The Studebaker US-6, a 2.5-ton truck built in South Bend, Indiana, was not a glamorous machine. It was boxy and utilitarian, with a canvas roof, a straight-six engine, and a 6-wheel drive that could handle mud, snow, and roads that were little more than wagon tracks. Soviet soldiers called it the Studer. They did not speak of it with affection, but they relied on it absolutely. Without the Studebaker, the Red Army's artillery would have been immobile, its ammunition dumps unreachable, its logistics paralyzed. The truck was the sinew that held the Soviet war machine together, and by 1943, nearly half of the Red Army's transport capacity depended on vehicles built in Detroit, Flint, and South Bend. Senior Sergeant Viktor Sokolov drove a Studebaker with the 7th Guards Artillery Brigade. He was 26 years old, a former collective farm mechanic from a village outside Voronezh that no longer existed. The Germans had burned it in the summer of 1942, and Sokolov had not been home since. He did not expect to go home again. He expected to die, like most of the men he had known, and his survival to this point felt less like skill than blind luck. He drove the truck because someone had to, and because he understood engines in a way that many of his comrades did not. The Studebaker was simple to maintain, easier than the Soviet-built ZS-5, and it started reliably, even in cold, that would kill a man in minutes. Sokolov appreciated this. He did not think about where the truck had come from, or who had built it, or what it had cost to deliver. He thought about keeping it running, about not getting stuck, and about not driving over a mine. The ammunition convoys moved at night. The roads were cratered and narrow, lined with burned-out vehicles and unmarked graves. German aircraft patrolled during the day, strafing anything that moved, and so the convoys waited for darkness and then rolled forward in blackout conditions, headlights off, following the truck ahead by instinct and the faint glow of the tail light that was sometimes permitted. Sokolov drove with his window open, listening for the sound of aircraft engines, his hands light on the wheel. Behind him, the truck bed was loaded with 122 mm howitzer shells, stacked in wooden crates and lashed down with rope. If a shell broke loose and struck something hard, the explosion would vaporize the truck and everything within 50 meters. Sokolov tried not to think about that either. By the summer of 1943, Lend-Lease deliveries were arriving in volume. The Persian Corridor, a supply route running from the Persian Gulf through Iran and into Soviet Central Asia, carried fuel, vehicles, and raw materials that the Soviet Union could no longer produce in sufficient quantities. American-built locomotives hauled Soviet freight. American canned meat, derisively called Second Front by Soviet soldiers who wanted an invasion of Europe more than they wanted Spam, supplemented rations that were already meager. American radio equipment allowed Soviet commanders to coordinate attacks across distances that would have been impossible otherwise. The aid was not charity. It was calculation, a recognition by Roosevelt and his advisors that keeping the Soviet Union in the fight was cheaper in American lives than invading Europe alone. Stalin understood this. He accepted the aid without gratitude and complained constantly that it was not enough, that the real Second Front had not opened, that Soviet soldiers were dying while the Americans and British delayed. He was not entirely wrong. The Battle of Kursk began in July. The Germans attacked with nearly 3,000 tanks, hoping to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the salient and regain the initiative they had lost at Stalingrad. The Red Army, forewarned by intelligence and fortified by months of preparation, absorbed the blow and counterattacked. Sokolov's brigade moved forward with the offensive, the Studebakers hauling howitzers and ammunition through mud and dust, keeping pace with the advancing infantry. The trucks broke down, were repaired, broke down again. Sokolov worked on his engine by the side of the road while shells whistled overhead, replacing a fuel pump with one cannibalized from a wrecked vehicle, his hands black with grease. He got the truck running and rejoined the convoy. No one thanked him. There was no time for thanks. The offensive ground forward through the summer and into the autumn. The Red Army recaptured Kharkov, crossed the Dnieper and pushed toward the old Soviet border. The Germans fought for every kilometer, but they were retreating, and the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Sokolov drove through villages that had been obliterated, past fields churned into moonscapes by artillery, past columns of German prisoners stumbling west under guard. He saw a child's shoe lying in the road and swerved to avoid it. He did not know why. The shoe meant nothing. It was simply there, and then it was behind him, and he did not look back. By the end of 1943, the Soviet Union had received over 6,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, and 200,000 trucks through Lend-Lease. The aircraft were mostly obsolete by American standards, P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks that had been surpassed by newer models. But Soviet pilots flew them effectively in ground attack roles, and the planes freed up Soviet production capacity for other needs. The tanks were less successful, the American M4 Sherman and the British Churchill ill-suited to Soviet tactical doctrine and mechanical preferences, but they filled gaps and kept divisions moving. It was the trucks that mattered most. Soviet industry could build tanks and aircraft, but it could not build trucks in the quantities the Red Army required. The Studebaker, the Dodge WC series, the Willys Jeep, these became the arteries through which the Soviet offensive flowed. Without them, the Red Army's advance would have stalled for lack of supply, and the war would have dragged on for years longer, at a cost no one could calculate. In November 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Tehran. The three men sat together for the first time, discussing the invasion of France, the future of Poland, and the post-war order. Stalin pressed for a firm commitment on the Second Front. Churchill argued for operations in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt sided with Stalin, and the decision was made. The invasion would come in the spring of 1944 in Normandy. Stalin left Tehran satisfied, if not friendly. The aid would continue, the Red Army would press west, and when the war ended, the question of who owed what to whom would be buried beneath the rubble of a shattered continent. Sokolov crossed the old Soviet border in the spring of 1944, driving through a landscape that looked as if it had been hammered by gods. The forests were gone, the villages erased, the fields sown with mines and barbed wire. The Red Army advanced into Poland, into the Baltics, into the ruins of nations that had been ground to dust between two totalitarian powers. Sokolov did not think about politics. He thought about the road, about fuel consumption, about the rattle in the engine that he had not yet diagnosed. He thought about the letter from his sister, the first he had received in 2 years, telling him that she had survived, that she was in a factory city in the Urals, that she asked about him in her prayers. He had not written back. He did not know what to say. By the winter of 1945, the Red Army stood on the Oder River, less than 100 kilometers from Berlin. Sokolov's brigade had been in continuous action for 18 months. The Studebaker he drove was not the same one he had started with. That truck had thrown a rod outside Lvov and been abandoned. The current truck had been pulled from a depot in Warsaw, repaired, and pressed into service. It ran well enough. Sokolov no longer cared about much beyond that. The end of the war was visible now, not as an abstraction, but as a physical place, a city that would be taken or destroyed. The cost would be enormous. Sokolov knew this. He had seen enough to know that the final battles were always the worst, that desperation made men vicious, and that the Red Army would pay in blood for every street in Berlin. He crossed the Oder on a pontoon bridge in the early morning darkness. The truck loaded with shells, the river black and silent beneath him. He did not know that the steel in the bridge had been shipped from Pennsylvania, or that the fuel in his tank had come through the Persian Corridor, or that the boots he wore had been made in a factory in Massachusetts. He did not know about Edward Callahan, or the Thomas Jefferson, or the men who had died in the Arctic to deliver the cargo that had kept the Red Army moving. No one had told him these things, and it would not have mattered if they had. The war had reduced everything to the immediate, to survival and the completion of the mission. Sokolov crossed the bridge and the truck climbed the far bank, and the convoy rolled forward into Germany. Behind him the sun rose over the river, pale and cold, and somewhere in the distance the guns began to fire.